Hey there, truth seekers. What if I told you that everything you know about your family tree might only go back about 150 years? And that's not because your ancestors were bad at record keeping. We're talking about photographs of massive, pristine cities from the 1800s that look suspiciously empty, like someone built an entire civilization and forgot to add the people. Grand boulevards designed for thousands, sitting there like a ghost town movie set. Meanwhile, incubators, yeah, those baby warming boxes, were being displayed at world fairs like carnival attractions, with crowds munching popcorn while staring at rows of infants in glass cases. Weird? Absolutely. Coincidence? Well, that's what we're here to figure out. Today we're diving into what some call the Great Reset. Not the conspiracy theory trending on social media, but an alleged 19th century event where cities appeared fully formed, populations seemingly vanished, and a whole new generation showed up via orphan trains, like Amazon deliveries of human beings. We're talking industrial-scale baby incubators, postcards advertising babies for sale, and demographic records with gaps so convenient they'd make a politician jealous. Sound insane? Sure does. But the evidence? That's where things get interesting. So before we jump down this rabbit hole together, smash that like button if you're ready for your brain to do backflips, and drop a comment. What city are you watching from? I want to know who's brave enough to question everything they were taught in history class. Buckle up, because this one's going to get wild. Let's start with something that should immediately strike you as weird if you've ever scrolled through old photographs from the 1800s. Picture this. You're looking at images of major cities. We're talking grand boulevards, ornate buildings, perfectly paved streets stretching for blocks, and something's missing. Not the color, obviously, because color photography wasn't a thing yet. No, what's missing are the people. Like, all of them. These cities look like someone hit pause on civilization right after construction wrapped up but before anyone moved in. Now before you say, well, maybe exposure times were long and people just blurred out, let me stop you right there. That excuse works for maybe one or two photos. But we're talking about thousands of images across dozens of cities on multiple continents, all showing the same bizarre pattern. Streets wide enough to accommodate massive crowds. Think Times Square on New Year's Eve levels of capacity, sitting there empty as a parking lot at 3 a.m. And not just empty in a slow Tuesday afternoon kind of way. We're talking zero people. No workers, no pedestrians, no random guy selling newspapers on the corner. Nothing. Just pristine infrastructure sitting there like a movie set after everyone went home for lunch and never came back. The truly bizarre part? These aren't ruins. They're not ancient cities crumbling into dust. These buildings look brand new. The architecture is flawless. We're talking intricate stonework, perfectly aligned facades, elaborate decorative elements that would take teams of skilled craftsmen years to complete. Everything's in pristine condition, as if the grand opening was scheduled for next week. Except there's no one there to attend said grand opening. No construction crews finishing up last-minute details. No excited residents moving furniture into their new homes. Just silence, frozen on film. Take a look at photographs of major American cities in the mid-1800s. San Francisco, for instance, supposedly a booming gold rush destination where people were literally fighting over housing. The photos show massive commercial districts with multi-story buildings, elaborate storefronts, and infrastructure that could support tens of thousands of residents. Yet the streets? Empty as a desert highway. You'd expect at least a few gold-crazed prospectors stumbling around, right? Maybe some merchants hawking supplies to the fortune seekers? Nope. Ghost town aesthetics with five-star architecture. Not exactly the frontier chaos you'd imagine from history textbooks. Or consider European cities during the same period. Paris, supposedly in the middle of Baron Haussmann's massive renovation project that employed thousands of workers and displaced hundreds of thousands of residents. The official story tells us this was the most ambitious urban construction project of the century, with crews tearing down medieval neighborhoods and rebuilding the entire city. Sounds pretty crowded and chaotic, right? Yet photographs from this era show brand new boulevards. We're talking the iconic wide streets Paris is famous for, completely devoid of the construction chaos, the displaced residents, or even basic foot traffic. It's like someone built a replica of Paris in the middle of nowhere and forgot to populate it. Unfortunately for the official narrative, that's a pretty significant oversight. Now, let's talk about the sheer scale of these empty cities, because this is where things get really interesting. We're not discussing small towns or frontier outposts where Sure, maybe everyone was out farming or something. These are major metropolitan centers with infrastructure designed for massive populations. Buildings with hundreds of windows, suggesting hundreds of residents. Commercial districts with dozens of elaborate storefronts, implying thriving business communities. Public squares, designed to accommodate thousands for markets, festivals, or public gatherings. And yet, in photo after photo, these spaces sit empty. Not moderately populated but quiet. Not everyone's inside having lunch. Completely, utterly, suspiciously empty. The architectural sophistication makes it even stranger. These buildings aren't simple wooden structures thrown up quickly by settlers. We're talking about stone construction with classical architectural elements. Columns, arches, detailed cornices, ornate window frames. The kind of stuff that requires serious engineering knowledge, skilled craftsmen, and significant time to complete. Someone with expertise designed these cities. Someone with resources funded them. Teams of workers supposedly built them. And yet, when the camera captures them, it's as if all those people vanished the moment construction finished, leaving behind a perfectly crafted stage with no actors to perform on it. Here's where the official explanation starts falling apart like a house of cards in a windstorm. Historians will tell you that early photography required long exposure times, sometimes several minutes, so moving people and vehicles simply didn't show up in the images. Fair enough for the 1840s when you needed to sit still for what felt like an eternity just to capture a blurry portrait. But by the 1860s and 1870s, exposure times had dramatically decreased. We have plenty of photographs from this period showing people clearly visible in various poses. Workers on job sites, crowds at events, individuals walking down streets. The technology existed to capture movement. So why do we have this specific category of urban photographs that consistently show no people whatsoever? And it's not like photographers were exclusively shooting at 4 a.m. when everyone was asleep. These images were often taken during what should have been peak daylight hours, the ideal time for photography, sure, but also the time when cities should be bustling with activity. Businesses should be open. People should be working, shopping, traveling. Instead, we get image after image of perfectly lit, expertly composed photographs of beautiful, elaborate, completely abandoned cityscapes. It's like someone was documenting a world that existed, but hadn't been activated yet. Naturally, this raises some uncomfortable questions about what we've been told regarding urban development in this era. Let's dig into the specifics of what these photographs actually show. First, the streets themselves. We're not talking about narrow medieval lanes or dirt paths. These are wide paved boulevards with proper curbs, sometimes even early streetcar tracks already installed. The infrastructure is there: drainage systems, gas lamp posts, paved sidewalks. Everything's ready for use, just missing the users. It's like buying a fully furnished house with all utilities connected, then never moving in. Possible? Sure. Weird? Absolutely. Repeated across multiple cities worldwide? Now we're entering something's not adding up territory. The buildings tell an even more interesting story. Look closely at the architectural details in these photographs. You'll notice that structures which supposedly took years to build appear suddenly in the photographic record. Not gradually, showing various stages of construction, but fully completed, as if they materialized overnight. 1 year, nothing. Next year, boom, entire city blocks of elaborate buildings. The photographic progression doesn't match what you'd expect from organic urban growth, where you'd see buildings at different stages of completion, construction materials cluttering the streets, scaffolding, work crews, the messy reality of building a city from scratch. Instead, what we see is more like someone downloading a complete city file and hitting install. All the buildings appear finished simultaneously. Architectural styles are remarkably uniform across entire districts, and, here's the kicker, they all look brand new. No weathering, no wear patterns, no signs that some buildings are older than others. In a real city that grew organically over time, you'd expect architectural evolution. Older structures showing their age next to newer ones, different styles reflecting different construction periods, varying states of maintenance. But in these photographs, everything looks contemporary with everything else, as if an entire city was constructed according to a master plan and completed all at once. Which is weird, because that's not how cities typically develop, especially in the supposedly chaotic and loosely regulated 1800s. The scale of the infrastructure is another red flag waving so hard it might take off. Take waterfront cities, for example. The photographs show massive dock systems, warehouses, and port facilities that would require enormous amounts of labor and resources to build. These aren't simple wooden piers. We're talking elaborate stone constructions, multiple stories of warehousing, complex loading systems, the kind of infrastructure that serves major commercial operations. Yet the photos show these facilities empty, unused, pristine. No ships docked, no cargo being loaded or unloaded, no workers bustling about. It's like someone built the world's most elaborate port and then forgot to tell the shipping industry it existed. Or consider the railway infrastructure appearing in photographs from this era. Stations designed to handle thousands of passengers per day, with ornate waiting rooms, multiple platforms, extensive track systems, all sitting empty in image after image. Not empty because the train just left empty, but nobody has ever used this empty. No luggage, no vendors, no people waiting for arrivals. Just beautiful, expensive, completely underutilized transportation infrastructure. Unsurprisingly, this suggests these facilities weren't built to serve existing demand, but rather were constructed in anticipation of a population that hadn't arrived yet, which is a very unusual approach to urban planning, unless you know something about future population numbers that you're not sharing with the class. Now let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the absence of elephants, horses, carriages, or any form of transportation in these empty city photographs. The 1800s relied heavily on horse-drawn vehicles for everything from personal transport to goods delivery. Cities should be full of horses, carriages, carts, and all the associated infrastructure and mess that comes with horse-based transportation. Where are the stables? Where's the horse manure that should be piling up in streets? A very real problem in 19th century cities. Where are the water troughs for the animals? In photographs of supposedly thriving cities, this stuff should be everywhere. Instead, we see pristine streets looking like they've never hosted a single horse-drawn cart. It's cleaner than modern cities after street sweepers pass through, which is impressive considering the supposed lack of municipal sanitation services in this era. The commercial districts present their own puzzles. Photographs show rows of elaborate storefronts. We're talking fancy display windows, ornate signage, multi-story commercial buildings with ground-floor retail and upper-floor offices or apartments. Everything looks ready for business. The windows are intact, the doors are in place, signs are hung, but there's no indication of actual commerce happening. No goods displayed in windows, no advertisements posted, no evidence of inventory or customers. It's like walking through a brand new shopping mall on the day before the grand opening, when all the stores are built and ready, but nothing's stocked yet, and no one's been hired. Except this isn't one shopping mall. It's entire commercial districts across multiple cities, all showing the same ready but not operational status. Here's another fascinating detail: the architectural uniformity across supposedly independent cities. When you look at photographs from different cities during this period, say Denver, Chicago, St. Louis, you notice suspicious similarities in architectural style, building techniques, and urban layout. Not just, oh, they're all Victorian-era similarities, but specific design elements that repeat across locations. Buildings with identical window patterns, storefronts with remarkably similar facade designs, streets laid out with similar widths and configurations. It's as if someone was working from the same blueprint book across the entire continent, which is odd for an era when communication was slow, travel was difficult, and cities supposedly developed their own distinctive characters based on local needs and resources. The level of infrastructure coordination is particularly suspicious. Look at cities that supposedly grew independently during the same period. They all seem to have adopted similar systems for street layouts, grid patterns with consistent block sizes. They all have similar public buildings, courthouses, libraries, schools, showing remarkably similar architectural approaches. They all have comparable utility infrastructure appearing at roughly the same time: gas lighting, water systems, sewage. This kind of standardization would require significant coordination and planning across vast distances, which seems unlikely given the supposed limitations of 19th century communication and governance. Unless, of course, there was some centralized planning happening that the historical record doesn't acknowledge. Let's talk about the public buildings specifically, because they're particularly revealing. Photographs show massive structures: city halls, train stations, post offices, libraries, that would serve populations far larger than the cities supposedly had at the time. Why would a city of a few thousand residents build a train station designed to handle tens of thousands of passengers? Why construct a library with capacity for collections that wouldn't exist for decades? The standard explanation is planning for future growth. But that requires a level of confidence in future expansion that seems wildly optimistic, especially in an era when cities regularly failed and were abandoned. It's like building a 50-story office tower in a town with 3 businesses and hoping things work out. Possible? Maybe. Practical? Not remotely. The photographic evidence also reveals something interesting about construction techniques. When you examine the images closely, you notice that buildings which supposedly took years to construct show no weathering differences between older and newer sections. In real construction projects that span multiple years, you'd expect the earliest completed portions to show some wear by the time the project finishes. But in these photographs, everything looks uniformly new. The bottom floors of a multi-story building show the same pristine condition as the top floors, despite supposedly being built years apart. The stonework shows no differential weathering. The paint looks freshly applied everywhere. It's as if the entire structure was completed all at once, which contradicts the official timelines claiming gradual construction over extended periods. Here's where it gets even weirder. Some photographs show cities that supposedly didn't exist a few years prior, yet the infrastructure appears too sophisticated for such recent construction. We're talking about cities that officially sprang up during gold rushes or other sudden population booms, where theoretically everything should be hastily built and fairly basic. Instead, the photographs show elaborate architecture, complex infrastructure, and urban planning that suggests decades of development rather than a few years of frantic build. It's like the difference between a campground thrown together over a weekend and a planned resort community. Except the official history claims these cities were essentially the campground version, while the photographs clearly show the resort version. The positioning of these cities raises questions too. Many of these elaborate, empty urban centers appear in locations that don't make obvious strategic sense. They're not always at major crossroads, natural harbors, or resource-rich locations that would justify such significant investment. Some are in the middle of relatively inhospitable areas where supplying materials and labor for major construction projects would be incredibly challenging. Yet there they are, fully built, perfectly maintained, sitting empty. It's as if location wasn't chosen based on natural advantages or existing populations, but according to some other criteria, perhaps predetermined settlement patterns designed to distribute population according to a master plan. The lack of construction debris in these photographs is notable too. Major building projects create massive amounts of waste: stone chips, wood scraps, discarded materials, dirt from excavations. This stuff doesn't disappear quickly, especially in an era without modern waste management. Yet photographs of these supposedly recently completed cities show clean streets, no construction debris, no piles of leftover materials. Either they had the most efficient cleanup crews in history, or the construction process didn't happen the way we've been told. Considering that modern construction sites take weeks to fully clean up after completion, the pristine condition of these 19th century cities suggests something unusual about how they came into existence. The window situation deserves special mention because it's genuinely bizarre. Windows are expensive, fragile, and difficult to transport, especially in the 1800s. Yet these photographs show buildings with hundreds of intact glass windows, all apparently installed and perfect. No broken panes, no boarded-up windows, no protective shutters. In a real city under construction or recently completed, you'd expect at least some window damage. Accidents happen, vandalism occurs, weather breaks things. But these cities look like they came with a warranty that covered absolutely everything. Every window intact, every pane perfectly in place, as if the buildings were manufactured complete rather than constructed on site. The seasonal timing of photographs presents another puzzle. We have empty city photographs taken across different seasons: spring, summer, fall, judging by vegetation and light conditions. If the cities were genuinely abandoned or between population phases, you'd expect to see seasonal effects. Plants growing in streets, snow accumulation in winter, storm damage, general degradation. Instead, the cities maintain the same pristine appearance regardless of when the photograph was taken. Someone was maintaining these empty cities, keeping them ready for occupation. Which raises the obvious question: who was doing this maintenance, and where are they in the photographs? Now, the really uncomfortable part. We have to ask ourselves, who could have built all this? The official story involves regular working people, immigrants, laborers, craftsmen, constructing these cities through conventional means. But the coordination required to build multiple elaborate cities across vast distances, all during the same relatively short time period, with similar architectural standards and infrastructure, suggests something more organized than individual. Cities hiring local workers and figuring things out as they went. We're talking about a level of planning and resource allocation that would require serious institutional power, probably governmental or even supra-governmental organization. The kind of centralized authority that could dictate urban designs, coordinate construction timing, and ensure consistency across regions. The question of builders is particularly vexing. Massive construction projects require huge workforces. Where are the worker communities that would have supported such projects? Where are the photographs of construction camps, temporary housing, supply chains feeding materials to job sites? We have plenty of photographs from later periods showing workers building railroads, bridges, and other infrastructure projects. Images that prove photographers were interested in documenting labor and construction. So why do we lack comparable photographs of the workers who supposedly built these elaborate empty cities? Did they all leave immediately after finishing their work? Did they specifically avoid being photographed? Or were they not there in the first place because the construction happened differently than the official story suggests? The economic implications are staggering. Building cities requires enormous capital investment. Stone, lumber, glass, metals, labor, it all costs serious money. Who funded these projects? The standard answer is private investors, local governments, or land speculators betting on future growth. But the scale of construction and the apparent coordination across multiple cities suggests funding sources way beyond local investors or town councils. We're talking about capital allocation that would typically require national governments or international financial institutions. Yet the historical record doesn't show obvious paper trails for such massive funding operations. The money had to come from somewhere, and somewhere seems suspiciously vague for projects of this magnitude. Let's also consider the skills required. The architecture in these photographs isn't amateur work. We're seeing classical design principles, advanced engineering, sophisticated construction techniques. This requires trained architects, experienced engineers, skilled craftsmen. Where did all these experts come from? How were they recruited? How were they trained? Creating an educated workforce capable of building cities with this level of sophistication takes time. You can't just throw together a construction crew and expect them to produce elaborate Victorian architecture. There should be evidence of educational institutions training these workers, architectural firms designing these projects, engineering consultancies providing expertise, the infrastructure to create the infrastructure, so to speak. And while we have some records of such institutions, the numbers don't seem adequate for the volume of construction supposedly happening. The timeline compression is another red flag. When you map out construction dates based on official records and compare them to photographic evidence, things don't quite add up. Cities that supposedly took decades to build appear substantially complete in photographs within just a few years. Either construction happened much faster than should have been possible with 19th century technology, or the official timelines are wrong. Given that we know construction technology of the era, no power tools, limited heavy machinery, animal and human labor, the rapid appearance of elaborate cities seems physically implausible. It's like claiming someone hand-built a modern skyscraper in 6 months. The math doesn't work unless there's something we're missing about the methods or timing. So where does this leave us? We have photographs showing elaborate, empty cities that appear fully formed but unpopulated. We have infrastructure designed for populations that don't exist yet. We have architectural sophistication and urban planning that seems too advanced and too coordinated for the supposedly chaotic and individualistic development of this era. We have construction timelines that don't match the photographic evidence. And we have a suspicious absence of the workers, residents, and daily activities that should accompany urban development on this scale. The conventional explanation asks us to believe in a series of remarkable coincidences, that exposure times happened to consistently eliminate people from thousands of photographs across multiple cities, that these cities all independently developed similar architectural styles and urban layouts, that rapid construction was somehow possible despite technological limitations, that massive projects left no construction debris or worker presence, and that empty cities were perfectly maintained by invisible caretakers. That's a lot of coincidences stacked on top of each other. At some point, you have to wonder if the simpler explanation is that cities weren't built the way we've been told, that they were constructed according to a planned schedule, prepared in advance of population arrival, and ready for occupation when the time came. Which leads to the next uncomfortable question. If the cities were ready and waiting, where was the population that eventually filled them? And why does the demographic record from this period show such strange patterns? But that's a story for the next chapter. So we've established that cities were sitting empty, ready and waiting for populations that hadn't arrived yet. Now comes the uncomfortable question. Where did those populations eventually come from? And here's where things get genuinely weird. Because the answer involves baby incubators displayed at amusement parks. Yes, you heard that right. We're about to discuss how infant care technology that supposedly saved premature babies was actually designed more like factory equipment, and how society was conditioned to view human beings as products through one of the strangest public spectacles in modern history. Let's start with the technology itself, because when you actually look at early incubator designs, something immediately seems off. The official story tells us incubators were developed as life-saving medical devices for premature infants. Noble, compassionate, all about saving fragile babies who needed extra care. Heartwarming stuff. Except when you examine the actual patents and blueprints from this era, these contraptions look less like medical equipment and more like something you'd see in a chicken hatchery. We're talking about industrial-scale designs with the capacity to house not just one or two babies, but dozens or even hundreds simultaneously. Which is weird for a medical device supposedly created to handle the occasional premature birth emergency. The design specifications are particularly revealing. Early incubator patents show systems with modular construction, essentially plug-and-play units that could be expanded indefinitely by adding more chambers. You could literally scale up from handling 10 babies to handling 100 babies, just by connecting more units together, like assembling a production line. The heating systems weren't individualized for each infant, but rather centralized, warming multiple chambers from a single source. Temperature controls were standardized across all units. Ventilation systems served entire rows of incubators simultaneously. Everything about the design suggests mass processing rather than individualized medical care. It's the difference between a boutique hospital nursery and a factory floor. And these designs definitely leaned toward the factory end of the spectrum. The capacity numbers are genuinely staggering when you dig into the documentation. We're not talking about equipment designed to handle a small hospital's occasional premature birth. Some of these installations were designed to accommodate hundreds of infants at once. Let's put that in perspective. Even today, with our much larger populations, a typical hospital might have a neonatal intensive care unit with maybe 20 to 40 beds. These 19th century incubator facilities were planning for capacities 5 or 10 times larger. Either they were expecting epidemic levels of premature births, which would be concerning for entirely different reasons, or they had other plans for what would be filling all those little glass boxes. The construction materials are interesting too. These weren't delicate, precision medical instruments. They were built like industrial equipment: sturdy metal frames, thick glass panels, basic plumbing and heating systems you could repair with standard tools. No specialized components, no complex mechanisms that would require expert maintenance. Everything was designed for durability and ease of operation by people who weren't necessarily medical professionals. It's like the difference between a surgical laser and a blowtorch. Both produce heat, but one requires a medical degree to operate, and the other just requires someone who can turn a valve. These incubators were definitely in the turn a valve category of sophistication. Here's where it gets particularly suspicious. The timeline of incubator development doesn't match the supposed medical need. Premature births have been a constant throughout human history. Not a sudden epidemic that appeared in the late 1800s requiring emergency technological solutions. Yet incubator technology exploded during this specific period, with patents filed, facilities built, and systems deployed on a scale that suggests preparation for something much larger than addressing natural premature birth rates. The technology appeared too quickly, spread too widely, and scaled up too dramatically to be a simple response to existing medical conditions. It's like someone knew they'd need industrial-scale infant processing capacity and worked backward to create the technology to provide it. The geographical distribution of incubator facilities raises eyebrows too. These installations didn't just appear in major medical centers where you'd expect cutting-edge healthcare innovation. They showed up in places that seem random from a medical standpoint: fairgrounds, exhibition halls, amusement parks, even some commercial districts. Why would life-saving medical equipment designed for fragile, premature infants be installed in entertainment venues? The standard explanation is that these were demonstration units to educate the public about modern medicine. But that explanation falls apart when you realize the scale we're talking about. You don't need a facility capable of handling 100 babies just to demonstrate the concept to visitors. 1 or 2 units would suffice for educational purposes. The actual installations were way oversized for simple demonstrations, suggesting they were intended for actual operational use, not just show and tell. Now let's talk about what's probably the most bizarre aspect of this whole situation. Baby incubators became literal carnival attractions. We're not talking about discreet medical displays at serious scientific conferences. We're talking about full-on amusement park sideshows where the general public could pay admission to walk through facilities filled with rows of babies in glass boxes. Imagine that scene for a moment. Families out for a fun day at the fair, kids eating cotton candy, and between the Ferris wheel and the knife-throwing act, there's a building where you can go stare at human infants in incubators like they're exotic fish in aquarium tanks. Not exactly the wholesome entertainment you'd expect from an era supposedly obsessed with Victorian morality and propriety. These incubator exhibits appeared at major world's fairs and expositions throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s. The Pan American Exposition, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, Coney Island's Luna Park. These weren't fringe events. These were massive, officially sanctioned public gatherings, attended by hundreds of thousands or even millions of visitors. And there, right alongside displays of technological innovation and cultural achievement, were buildings full of babies on public display. The exhibits were professionally organized, complete with uniformed nurses, educational signage, and admission fees. Everything was legitimized and normalized through the mechanism of the World's Fair format. It's like someone decided the best way to introduce a radical concept, that babies could be mass-produced and raised outside traditional families, was to literally put it on display and charge admission. The presentation style is particularly telling. These weren't somber medical environments where visitors were expected to be quiet and respectful. They were designed as entertainment venues. The babies were arranged in neat rows, numbered and labeled, sometimes with informational placards describing their weights, ages, and conditions. Visitors could walk down aisles, examining the infants from multiple angles, taking their time to study each one. It was essentially a living catalog. People would stand there, eating snacks, chatting with friends, while casually examining helpless babies like they were shopping for puppies at a pet store. The casualness of it all is what makes it so disturbing. This wasn't presented as something shocking or controversial, but as normal entertainment suitable for the whole family. The proximity to eugenics exhibits is particularly creepy. At many of these fairs and expositions, the incubator displays were physically located near or adjacent to eugenics pavilions, facilities promoting the science of improving human genetic stock through selective breeding. You could literally walk from one exhibit teaching you about scientifically managing human reproduction directly into another exhibit showing you rows of babies being raised in controlled, standardized conditions. The connection was impossible to miss. The message being sent, whether intentionally or not, was that human beings could be produced, selected, and raised according to scientific principles, just like livestock breeding programs. Unsurprisingly, this wasn't subtle messaging. It was right there in your face, normalized through repetition and official endorsement. The staffing of these facilities is interesting too. The nurses and attendants working these exhibits weren't necessarily medical professionals in the modern sense. Many were essentially showmen and entrepreneurs who had figured out that baby incubator displays drew crowds and generated revenue. The most famous was a guy named Martin Cooney, though whether that was even his real name is disputed, who ran incubator exhibitions for decades as a profitable business venture. He claimed to be saving premature babies, and maybe he was, but the business model was pure carnival sideshow. Charge admission, draw crowds, generate publicity, repeat. The babies were the product being displayed, and the medical care was secondary to the entertainment value. It's like if a modern NICU decided to sell tickets and give tours to anyone willing to pay, which would rightfully be considered horrifically unethical today, but was apparently just fine in this era. The economic model deserves examination because it reveals a lot about what was actually happening. These incubator exhibits were profitable businesses. They made money. People paid to see babies in boxes, and they paid enough to cover the costs of running the facilities, paying staff, and generating profit for the operators. Think about what that means. There was enough public demand to view babies in incubators that you could run it as a sustainable business. That's not the market dynamics of emergency medical care. That's the market dynamics of popular entertainment. People weren't visiting these exhibits out of medical curiosity or educational interest. They were visiting because it was a thing to do, an attraction, a novelty. The babies were the draw, the spectacle, the reason people handed over money. The advertising for these exhibits is revealing too. Promotional materials emphasize the novelty and wonder of seeing babies kept alive through modern technology, framing it as a scientific marvel worthy of public attention. Posters showed neat rows of incubators, highlighting the mechanical ingenuity and systematic organization. The message was clear. Look at how we can control and manage human life using scientific methods and industrial equipment. This wasn't about the babies as individuals deserving care and dignity. It was about the system, the technology, the process. The infants were essentially props demonstrating the capability of the apparatus, which is a profoundly dehumanizing way to present human beings, but it worked as a marketing strategy because people showed up in droves. The international coordination of these exhibits is suspicious. Incubator displays appeared at major exhibitions across Europe, North America, and other regions within a relatively short time frame. The designs were similar, the operational approaches were comparable, and the messaging was consistent. This suggests coordination and planning rather than independent development. Someone was spreading this concept globally, ensuring that populations worldwide were exposed to the idea that babies could be raised outside traditional family structures, using standardized industrial equipment. The World's Fair circuit was the perfect vehicle for this normalization process. Respectable, internationally attended, officially endorsed, and presented as educational progress. The medical establishment's relationship with these exhibits is complicated. On one hand, some doctors recognized the potential of incubator technology for saving premature infants and collaborated with exhibitors. On the other hand, many physicians were uncomfortable with the commercialization and public spectacle. But the medical establishment's objections were muted and ineffective. The exhibits continued operating for decades, despite concerns about ethics, hygiene, and the exploitation of vulnerable infants. Either the medical profession lacked the power to shut down operations they found problematic, or there were larger forces at play ensuring these displays continued regardless of professional objections. Given the official nature of World's Fairs and the governmental involvement in these events, the second explanation seems more likely. The transition from exhibition to institutional care is worth noting. As these public displays eventually declined in the early 20th century, the incubator technology didn't disappear. It was absorbed into hospitals and orphanages. The equipment and techniques pioneered in carnival sideshows became standard medical practice. Which raises an interesting question. Was the public display phase a test run for broader implementation? Were these exhibits essentially pilot programs, demonstrating feasibility and conditioning public acceptance before rolling out incubator technology on a larger scale through official institutions? The timeline suggests this possibility. The public displays peaked during the proposed reset period, then transitioned into institutionalized infant care just as that generation would have needed to be integrated into society. The psychological impact of these exhibits shouldn't be underestimated. An entire generation grew up seeing babies displayed in glass boxes as normal entertainment. Children visited these exhibits with their parents, internalizing the message that human infants could be industrially produced and raised in standardized, controlled environments. This kind of cultural conditioning prepares populations to accept ideas that would otherwise seem outrageous. If you've spent your childhood casually viewing babies as exhibits at the fair, the concept of institutional child-rearing or mass orphan distribution seems less shocking. You've been primed to see children as manageable units in a system, rather than as individuals emerging from specific families with unique histories. The exhibits normalized artificial child-rearing on a mass psychological level. The documentation around these facilities is conveniently sparse in certain areas. We have plenty of promotional materials, newspaper accounts of the exhibits, and general descriptions. But detailed records about specific babies, where they came from, what happened to them afterward, who claimed them, are frustratingly incomplete. For operations that supposedly ran for years and processed hundreds or thousands of infants, the lack of detailed record-keeping is suspicious. It's like running a hospital with no patient files, a factory with no production logs, a business with no accounting books. Either record-keeping was spectacularly poor, or records were deliberately not kept, or they were kept but have since disappeared. Given that we have detailed records for plenty of other aspects of this era, the specific absence of comprehensive data about incubator babies seems less like accident and more like intentional obscurity. The connection to orphan distribution networks is particularly interesting. Many of these incubator facilities had relationships with orphanages and child-placing agencies. Babies who graduated from incubators often entered orphan care systems, and from there were distributed to families or institutions. The incubator exhibits served as the first stage in a pipeline. initial processing and care, public display and normalization, then integration into existing child distribution networks. The system was vertically integrated. Intake through incubators, public conditioning through exhibits, distribution through orphan trains and placement agencies. It's like Amazon's supply chain, except for human beings, which is a disturbing metaphor, but the organizational structure was remarkably similar to modern logistics operations. The eugenic implications couldn't have been lost on contemporary observers. These exhibits appeared during the peak of eugenic ideology, a period when improving the race through scientific management of reproduction was considered respectable policy. The incubator displays demonstrated that human reproduction could be separated from traditional family structures and brought under institutional control. Babies could be produced, or at least raised, in controlled environments according to standardized procedures. The natural family was optional. The system could replace it. This was eugenic ideology made manifest. Human reproduction managed by experts using technology in pursuit of population control objectives. The fact that this was presented as entertainment rather than alarming social engineering is a testament to how effectively the normalization process worked. The scale question returns with these exhibits. Why were so many incubators necessary? Official explanations cite premature births and demonstrating medical technology. But the numbers don't support these explanations. Premature birth rates would not justify the capacity we see in these facilities. And you don't need hundreds of demonstration units to show how incubators work. The scale suggests these facilities were designed to actually process large numbers of babies, not just display the concept. Which brings us back to uncomfortable questions. Where were all these babies coming from, and where were they going afterward? The volume of infants flowing through incubator systems seems inconsistent with natural birth patterns, suggesting these facilities were filling a role beyond simply caring for the occasional premature birth. So what are we really looking at here? Medical progress? Scientific advancement? Or something more systematic? The evidence suggests incubator technology served multiple purposes simultaneously. Yes, it saved some premature babies. That much is probably true. But the scale, design, distribution, and public presentation suggest the technology was also infrastructure for something larger. A system capable of processing large numbers of infants through standardized industrial equipment, while simultaneously conditioning the public to accept institutional child-rearing as normal and even entertaining. The incubator exhibits weren't just about the babies in the boxes. They were about teaching society to view human reproduction as something that could be industrialized, standardized, and managed by centralized systems rather than left to families and nature. And based on how quickly society accepted this idea, the conditioning process worked remarkably well. Which raises disturbing questions about what other social engineering projects might have succeeded through similar normalization techniques, and whether the generation raised through these systems was quite as naturally produced as the official history claims. So we've got industrial-scale baby incubators and public displays conditioning society to accept institutional child rearing. Now let's talk about how this whole operation was advertised, and how the products, and yes, I'm uncomfortable calling children products too, but that's apparently what we're dealing with, were actually distributed. Because it turns out, the Victorian era had a marketing and logistics system that would make modern e-commerce companies jealous. We're talking coded postcards that functioned as catalogs, and a railway distribution network that moved thousands of children across continents like freight shipments. Welcome to the supply chain from hell. Let's start with something you've probably seen without realizing how weird it actually is. Victorian-era postcards depicting babies. And I don't mean cute photographs of someone's actual infant. I'm talking about mass-produced illustrated cards showing babies emerging from cabbages, hatching from eggs, being delivered by storks, growing in gardens like vegetables, or popping out of flowers. These images were everywhere during the late 1800s and early 1900s, sold in shops, mailed between family members, collected as novelties. The standard explanation is that Victorians were prudish about reproduction and needed whimsical stories about where babies came from because they couldn't handle the biological reality, which would make sense if these were just fairy tales told to children. But these weren't verbal stories. They were mass-produced commercial products distributed on an industrial scale. And when you look closely at them, things get very strange very quickly. First, the sheer volume of production. We're not talking about a few quirky postcards making the rounds. These things were produced by the millions across multiple countries. Printing companies churned them out in huge quantities. They were available in nearly every shop that sold postcards. The imagery was remarkably consistent across different manufacturers and countries. Babies in cabbage patches, babies in eggs, babies delivered by storks. Almost like everyone was working from the same playbook. For something that's supposedly just whimsical Victorian humor, the coordination and scale suggest this was something more organized than random market forces generating similar products. It's like if suddenly every company worldwide started making the same exact greeting card design at the same time, without any apparent coordination. Suspicious doesn't even begin to cover it. Now let's talk about what's actually on these postcards, because the details are genuinely disturbing once you notice them. Many of these cards don't just show babies in fantastical settings, they include text. Phrases like "babies for sale," "select your model," "fresh stock available," complete with what appear to be catalog numbers or codes. Now, you might argue this was meant humorously, a joke about where babies come from. Except the numbering systems are too sophisticated for jokes. We're talking actual alphanumeric codes that appear systematically across different series of cards. Some postcards show literal price tags attached to baby. Others display infants arranged in rows with identifying markers, like merchandise displays. The imagery isn't subtle. These cards present babies as commercial products available for selection and purchase, which is a really weird joke if that's all it was, but makes perfect sense if these cards were actually serving as disguised advertising materials. The geographic distribution of these postcards is particularly revealing. When researchers have mapped where different series of baby postcards were most commonly sold and mailed, the patterns match up suspiciously well with locations of known orphanages, child placing agencies, and those incubator facilities we discussed earlier. Regions with high concentrations of institutional childcare also show high concentrations of baby postcard circulation. This isn't what you'd expect if these were just random novelty items. If they were simply popular culture, you'd expect relatively even distribution in areas with similar population densities and commercial activity. Instead, the distribution clusters around specific institutions involved in child placement. It's like finding that postcards advertising a specific product are most common near warehouses that stock that product, which makes sense for actual advertisements, but is weird for supposedly unrelated novelty items. Some postcards get even more explicit with their coded messaging. There are series showing babies with labels indicating origins, imported from Europe, American stock, fresh arrivals, using language identical to commercial shipping and inventory management. Other cards display babies with what look like destination tags, suggesting they're being shipped somewhere. The stork delivery theme takes on a darker meaning when you realize storks are shown carrying babies with address labels, essentially depicting a delivery service. And before you say, it's just cute imagery, consider that actual orphan placement agencies of this era used remarkably similar language in their internal documentation. Children were stock, families were customers, placement was delivery. Postcards were using the same terminology as the actual child distribution industry, which seems like quite a coincidence if they were unrelated. The artistic style of these postcards is worth examining too. They're not rough sketches or crude illustrations. Many were professionally produced with detailed artwork, high-quality printing, and careful design work. This required significant investment in production, hiring artists, setting up printing operations, managing distribution. Someone was spending serious money to create and distribute these images on a massive scale. Commercial publishers would only invest that heavily if they expected profit, meaning there had to be substantial demand. And the question becomes, why was there such enormous demand for images of babies presented as commercial products? Either Victorian society had the weirdest sense of humor imaginable, or these items were serving a practical purpose beyond mere entertainment. Now let's connect this to the physical infrastructure that was actually moving children around. Because while postcards were circulating with their coded messages, there was a very real, very physical system transporting thousands upon thousands of children across continents. The orphan train movement, officially presented as a charitable effort to find homes for unfortunate children, operated at a scale that should make anyone suspicious. Between the 1850s and 1930s, over 200,000 children, that's not a typo, 200,000 human beings, were transported via rail from eastern cities to destinations throughout the American interior. That's not a charitable operation. That's industrial-scale logistics. The operational details of orphan trains reveal an organization level that goes way beyond simple charity work. These weren't informal arrangements where someone decided to help a few kids. This was a systematic program with printed schedules, predetermined routes, coordinating organizations, government subsidies, and receiving communities that had been notified in advance. Railway companies received payment for these transports, meaning governments or large organizations were funding this operation. The children traveled in dedicated cars or sections of trains, accompanied by agents who managed the process. Stops were scheduled in advance, with local communities prepared to receive shipments. And yes, that's the word used in some documentation, shipments of children. This level of coordination requires institutional support, not just well-meaning individuals helping orphans. The routes themselves are fascinating when you map them out. Orphan trains didn't just randomly travel to wherever there happened to be demand for child labor or families wanting to adopt. The routes followed specific corridors, hitting towns and cities along predetermined paths. And here's the creepy part. When you overlay these railway routes with the locations of those empty cities from early photographs, there's significant overlap. Towns that appeared mysteriously complete but unpopulated in the 1860s and 1870s show up as orphan train destinations in the 1880s and 1890s. It's like someone built the cities first, then used the railway system to deliver the population needed to fill them. Which would be insane urban planning in any era, but especially in the supposedly chaotic and decentralized 19th century. Unless, of course, the planning was centralized and someone knew exactly how many people would be needed where. The distribution process at train stops is particularly revealing. When orphan trains arrived in towns, the children weren't carefully matched with loving families through thoughtful placement processes. They were literally lined up on train platforms or in town halls, and locals would examine them and select ones they wanted. It was a live auction without the bidding, just selection and claiming. Documentation describes children being inspected for physical fitness, having their teeth checked like livestock, being made to demonstrate strength or skills. The ones selected would leave with their new families. The ones not chosen would get back on the train and continue to the next stop. This wasn't adoption in any modern sense. This was labor distribution with a thin veneer of charitable language covering what was essentially human trafficking with government approval. The record-keeping around these transports is simultaneously meticulous and suspiciously incomplete. Organizations running orphan trains kept detailed logs of how many children were transported, which routes were used, which towns received children, and what the operating costs were. This documentation exists and shows sophisticated organizational capacity. However, information about individual children, their actual origins, their real family histories, what happened to them after placement, is often missing or contradictory. It's like someone kept careful track of the logistics while deliberately obscuring the human details. You can trace the movement of children as demographic units, but trying to follow individual stories often hits dead ends. Either record-keeping was bizarrely selective about what information mattered, or someone didn't want comprehensive records of individual children to exist. The financial structure is another massive red flag. Railway companies received government subsidies for transporting orphans. Let that sink in. This wasn't railways doing charity work. They were getting paid by governments to move these children. The subsidies were substantial enough that railway companies actively competed for orphan transport contracts. Some lines specifically advertised their orphan transport capabilities. This was profitable business, which means significant money was flowing from government sources into child transportation. Where was this money coming from? Government budgets don't usually have line items for industrial-scale child relocation, unless that's a recognized governmental function. The existence of these subsidies suggests orphan transport was considered important enough to merit dedicated public funding, which is weird for supposedly private charitable operations. The timing of orphan train operations aligns suspiciously with the period of supposed reset. The movement begins in earnest in the 1850s, peaks in the late 1800s, and gradually declines in the early 20th century. This timeline matches exactly with the period when empty cities needed population, incubator technology was being developed and displayed, and demographic records show strange gaps. It's like watching a multi-stage operation unfold. First, prepare the infrastructure, empty cities. Second, develop the production technology, incubators. Third, normalize the concept, public displays. Fourth, implement the distribution system, orphan trains. And finally, populate the prepared settlements. Each phase feeds into the next in a logical sequence that makes sense if someone was planning a demographic engineering project, but seems like an odd set of coincidences if everything was unrelated. The quota systems are particularly damning. Documents from child-placing agencies show that communities were expected to accept specific numbers of children. Not, we'll send children if you want them, but your town will receive X children on Y date. This wasn't demand-driven distribution where families requested children and agencies tried to fulfill requests. This was supply-driven distribution, where agencies had children to place and communities were expected to accept them according to predetermined allocations. It's exactly how you'd distribute population if you were deliberately populating empty settlements according to a demographic plan. Towns that had grown too slowly or weren't meeting population targets would receive larger shipments of children. It's like census data was being used to identify underpopulated areas, and children were being deployed to fill the gaps. The integration with existing institutional systems is revealing too. Orphan trains weren't operating in isolation. They were part of a larger ecosystem including workhouses, poorhouses, orphanages, reformatories, and other institutions that housed children. These facilities served as collection points, holding areas, and sorting centers. Children flowed into these institutions from various sources, were processed, and then were deployed via orphan trains or other placement systems. The whole thing functioned like a pipeline. Input from multiple sources, centralized processing, systematic distribution to endpoints. If you were designing a system to collect and redistribute population, this is exactly the infrastructure you'd create. The fact that this infrastructure existed and operated at this scale, all supposedly for charity work, is suspicious in itself. The legal frameworks supporting this operation are interesting too. Various laws were passed during this period that facilitated child removal and placement. Vagrancy laws, orphan codes, institutional commitment procedures, a whole body of legislation that made it easier to separate children from families and place them in institutional care or direct placement with new families. These laws weren't scattered coincidences. They were passed in multiple jurisdictions during the same time period, suggesting coordinated policy development. Someone was creating the legal infrastructure to enable mass child relocation, and they were doing it systematically across different states and even countries. That level of legal coordination requires serious institutional power and suggests child distribution was considered important enough to warrant dedicated legislative efforts. The receiving communities show interesting patterns too. Towns that took orphan-trained children often showed sudden population jumps that don't match natural growth rates. A small farming community might receive 30 or 40 children at once, representing a significant percentage increase in population, especially in the relevant age cohorts. These demographic injections would dramatically alter the community composition. Suddenly, there's a large youth population that needs to be integrated, educated, and eventually employed. From a community planning perspective, this is chaotic and challenging. Yet towns accepted these placements, suggesting either they desperately needed the labor, which argues for economic motivations rather than charity, or they were following directives from higher authorities. Either way, it doesn't suggest organic community development so much as managed population distribution. The long-term effects are still visible in some communities. If you look at genealogical records in towns that were major orphan train destinations, you'll find an unusual number of family trees that suddenly start in the late 1800s with children who arrived on orphan trains. Their histories before arrival are often missing or vague. The standard explanation is that records were lost, or families didn't want to discuss difficult pasts. But the pattern is consistent enough to suggest systemic obscurity, rather than individual cases of missing information. It's like entire generations have origin stories that begin with "arrived on a train" and nothing before that point. Which is exactly what you'd expect if those children were part of a population that was being deliberately inserted into communities without traditional family histories. The connection between postcards and trains becomes clearer when you realize both systems were operating simultaneously and serving complementary functions. Postcards normalized the idea that children were products that could be acquired. They created market awareness, so to speak. Trains provided the physical logistics to actually move children to where they were needed. It's like any commercial operation. You need advertising to create demand and logistics to fulfill that demand. The Victorian baby postcards were the marketing department. The orphan trains were the shipping department. Together, they formed a complete distribution system for moving human beings from production/collection points to end users. Framing it in commercial terms feels wrong because we're talking about children, but the operational structure perfectly matches commercial distribution systems, which suggests the people running this operation were thinking in exactly those terms. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, mass-produced postcards using commercial language to depict babies, Systematic railway operations moving thousands of children according to predetermined schedules and quotas. Government subsidies. Funding the logistics. Legal frameworks facilitating the process. And demographic outcomes showing population insertion into previously empty settlements. What you're looking at is infrastructure. Not charity, not random social welfare efforts. Infrastructure designed to collect, process, and distribute human beings according to a plan. The fact that this infrastructure existed, operated at scale for decades, and left behind both physical evidence and demographic effects suggests it wasn't accidental or coincidental. This was planned, funded, and executed as a systematic operation. Which brings us back to the question we keep dancing around. If cities were built empty and then populated through systematic distribution of children produced or collected through institutional systems, who planned this? Why did they do it? And what happened to the original population that should have been living in those cities? But those are questions for later chapters. For now, just sit with the fact that the Victorian era had a functioning supply chain for human beings, complete with advertising, logistics, government support, and delivery infrastructure. And apparently, everyone thought this was fine and normal, which tells you something about how effectively populations can be conditioned to accept things that should absolutely not be accepted. So we've got industrial-scale baby incubators and public displays conditioning society to accept institutional child-rearing. Now let's talk about how this whole operation was advertised and how the products, and yes, I'm uncomfortable calling children products too, but that's apparently what we're dealing with, were actually distributed. Because it turns out, the Victorian era had a marketing and logistics system that would make modern e-commerce companies jealous. We're talking coded postcards that functioned as catalogs, and a railway distribution network that moved thousands of children across continents like freight shipments. Welcome to the supply chain from hell. Let's start with something you've probably seen without realizing how weird it actually is. Victorian-era postcards depicting babies. And I don't mean cute photographs of someone's actual infant. I'm talking about mass-produced illustrated cards showing babies emerging from cabbages, hatching from eggs, being delivered by storks, growing in gardens like vegetables, or popping out of flowers. These images were everywhere during the late 1800s and early 1900s, sold in shops, mailed between family members, collected as novelties. The standard explanation is that Victorians were prudish about reproduction and needed whimsical stories about where babies came from because they couldn't handle the biological reality. Which would make sense if these were just fairy tales told to children. But these weren't verbal stories. They were mass-produced commercial products distributed on an industrial scale. And when you look closely at them, things get very strange very quickly. First, the sheer volume of production. We're not talking about a few quirky postcards making the rounds. These things were produced by the millions across multiple countries. Printing companies churned them out in huge quantities. They were available in nearly every shop that sold postcards. The imagery was remarkably consistent across different manufacturers and countries. Babies in cabbage patches, babies in eggs, babies delivered by storks. Almost like everyone was working from the same playbook. For something that's supposedly just whimsical Victorian humor, the coordination and scale suggest this was something more organized than random market forces generating similar products. It's like if suddenly every company worldwide started making the same exact greeting card design at the same time, without any apparent coordination. Suspicious doesn't even begin to cover it. Now let's talk about what's actually on these postcards, because the details are genuinely disturbing once you notice them. Many of these cards don't just show babies in fantastical settings. They include text. Phrases like, babies for sale, select your model, fresh stock available, complete with what appear to be catalog numbers or codes. Now, you might argue this was meant humorously, a joke about where babies come from. Except the numbering systems are too sophisticated for jokes. We're talking actual alphanumeric codes that appear systematically across different series of cards. Some postcards show literal price tags attached to babies. Others display infants arranged in rows with identifying markers, like merchandise displays. The imagery isn't subtle. These cards present babies as commercial products available for selection and purchase, which is a really weird joke if that's all it was, but makes perfect sense if these cards were actually serving as disguised advertising materials. The geographic distribution of these postcards is particularly revealing. When researchers have mapped where different series of baby postcards were most commonly sold and mailed, the patterns match up suspiciously well with locations of known orphanages, child placing agencies, and those incubator facilities we discussed earlier. Regions with high concentrations of institutional childcare also show high concentrations of baby postcard circulation. This isn't what you'd expect if these were just random novelty items. If they were simply popular culture, you'd expect relatively even distribution in areas with similar population densities and commercial activity. Instead, the distribution clusters around specific institutions involved in child placement. It's like finding that postcards advertising a specific product are most common near warehouses that stock that product, which makes sense for actual advertisements, but is weird for supposedly unrelated novelty items. Some postcards get even more explicit with their coded message. There are series showing babies with labels indicating origins, imported from Europe, American stock, fresh arrivals, using language identical to commercial shipping and inventory management. Other cards display babies with what look like destination tags, suggesting they're being shipped somewhere. The stork delivery theme takes on a darker meaning when you realize storks are shown carrying babies with address labels, essentially depicting a delivery service. And before you say, it's just cute imagery, consider that actual orphan placement agencies of this era used remarkably similar language in their internal documentation. Children were stock, families were customers, placement was delivery. The postcards were using the same terminology as the actual child distribution industry, which seems like quite a coincidence if they were unrelated. The artistic style of these postcards is worth examining too. They're not rough sketches or crude illustrations. Many were professionally produced with detailed artwork, high-quality printing, and careful design work. This required significant investment in production, hiring artists, setting up printing operations, managing distribution. Someone was spending serious money to create and distribute these images on a massive scale. Commercial publishers would only invest that heavily if they expected profit, meaning there had to be substantial demand. And the question becomes, why was there such enormous demand for images of babies presented as commercial products? Either Victorian society had the weirdest sense of humor imaginable, or these items were serving a practical purpose beyond mere entertainment. Now let's connect this to the physical infrastructure that was actually moving children around. Because while postcards were circulating with their coded messages, there was a very real, very physical system transporting thousands upon thousands of children across continents. The orphan train movement, officially presented as a charitable effort to find homes for unfortunate children, operated at a scale that should make anyone suspicious. Between the 1850s and 1930s, over 200,000 children, that's not a typo, 200,000 human beings, were transported via rail from eastern cities to destinations throughout the American interior. That's not a charitable operation. That's industrial-scale logistics. The operational details of orphan trains reveal an organization level that goes way beyond simple charity work. These weren't informal arrangements where someone decided to help a few kids. This was a systematic program with printed schedules, predetermined routes, coordinating organizations, government subsidies, and receiving communities that had been notified in advance. Railway companies received payment for these transports, meaning governments or large organizations were funding this operation. The children traveled in dedicated cars or sections of trains, accompanied by agents who managed the process. Stops were scheduled in advance, with local communities prepared to receive shipments. And yes, that's the word used in some documentation, shipments of children. This level of coordination requires institutional support, not just well-meaning individuals helping orphans. The routes themselves are fascinating when you map them out. Orphan trains didn't just randomly travel to wherever there happened to be demand for child labor or families wanting to adopt. The routes followed specific corridors hitting towns and cities along predetermined paths. And here's the creepy part. When you overlay these railway routes with the locations of those empty cities from early photographs, there's significant overlap. Towns that appeared mysteriously complete but unpopulated in the 1860s and 1870s show up as orphan train destinations in the 1880s and 1890s. It's like someone built the cities first, then used the railway system to deliver the population needed to fill them. Which would be insane urban planning in any era, but especially in the supposedly chaotic and decentralized 19th century. Unless, of course, the planning was centralized and someone knew exactly how many people would be needed where. The distribution process at train stops is particularly revealing. When orphan trains arrived in towns, the children weren't carefully matched with loving families through thoughtful placement processes. They were literally lined up on train platforms or in town halls, and locals would examine them and select ones they wanted. It was a live auction without the bidding, just selection and claiming. Documentation describes children being inspected for physical fitness, having their teeth checked like livestock, being made to demonstrate strength or skills. The ones selected would leave with their new families. The ones not chosen would get back on the train and continue to the next stop. This wasn't adoption in any modern sense. This was labor distribution with a thin veneer of charitable language covering what was essentially human trafficking with government approval. The record-keeping around these transports is simultaneously meticulous and suspiciously incomplete. Organizations running orphan trains kept detailed logs of how many children were transported, which routes were used, which towns received children, and what the operating costs were. This documentation exists and shows sophisticated organizational capacity. However, information about individual children, their actual origins, their real family histories, what happened to them after placement, is often missing or contradictory. It's like someone kept careful track of the logistics while deliberately obscuring the human details. You can trace the movement of children as demographic units, but trying to follow individual stories often hits dead ends. Either record-keeping was bizarrely selective about what information mattered, or someone didn't want comprehensive records of individual children to exist. The financial structure is another massive red flag. Railway companies received government subsidies for transporting orphans. Let that sink in. This wasn't railways doing charity work. They were getting paid by governments to move these children. The subsidies were substantial enough that railway companies actively competed for orphan transport contracts. Some lines specifically advertised their orphan transport capabilities. This was profitable business, which means significant money was flowing from government sources into child transportation. Where was this money coming from? Government budgets don't usually have line items for industrial-scale child relocation, unless that's a recognized governmental function. The existence of these subsidies suggests orphan transport was considered important enough to merit dedicated public funding, which is weird for supposedly private charitable operations. The timing of orphan train operations aligns suspiciously with the period of supposed reset. The movement begins in earnest in the 1850s, peaks in the late 1800s, and gradually declines in the early 20th century. This timeline matches exactly with the period when empty cities needed population. Incubator technology was being developed and displayed, and demographic records show strange gaps. It's like watching a multi-stage operation unfold. First, prepare the infrastructure, empty cities. Second, develop the production technology, incubators. Third, normalize the concept, public displays. Fourth, implement the distribution system, orphan trains. And finally, populate the prepared settlements. Each phase feeds into the next in a logical sequence that makes sense if someone was planning a demographic engineering project, but seems like an odd set of coincidences if everything was unrelated. The quota systems are particularly damning. Documents from child placing agencies show that communities were expected to accept specific numbers of children. Not, we'll send children if you want them, but your town will receive X children on Y date. This wasn't demand-driven distribution where families requested children and agencies tried to fulfill requests. This was supply-driven distribution where agencies had children to place and communities were expected to accept them according to predetermined allocations. It's exactly how you'd distribute population if you were deliberately populating empty settlements according to a demographic plan. Towns that had grown too slowly or weren't meeting population targets would receive larger shipments of children. It's like census data was being used to identify underpopulated areas, and children were being deployed to fill the gaps. The integration with existing institutional systems is revealing too. Orphan trains weren't operating in isolation. They were part of a larger ecosystem including workhouses, poorhouses, orphanages, reformatories, and other institutions that housed children. These facilities served as collection points, holding areas, and sorting centers. Children flowed into these institutions from various sources, were processed, and then were deployed via orphan trains or other placement systems. The whole thing functioned like a pipeline. Input from multiple sources, centralized processing, systematic distribution to endpoints. If you were designing a system to collect and redistribute population, this is exactly the infrastructure you'd create. The fact that this infrastructure existed and operated at this scale, all supposedly for charity work, is suspicious in itself. The legal frameworks supporting this operation are interesting too. Various laws were passed during this period that facilitated child removal and placement. Vagrancy laws, orphan codes, institutional commitment procedures, a whole body of legislation that made it easier to separate children from families and place them in institutional care or direct placement with new families. These laws weren't scattered coincidences. They were passed in multiple jurisdictions during the same time period, suggesting coordinated policy development. Someone was creating the legal infrastructure to enable mass child relocation, and they were doing it systematically across different states and even countries. That level of legal coordination requires serious institutional power and suggests child distribution was considered important enough to warrant dedicated legislative efforts. The receiving communities show interesting patterns too. Towns that took orphan-trained children often showed sudden population jumps that don't match natural growth rates. A small farming community might receive 30 or 40 children at once, representing a significant percentage increase in population, especially in the relevant age cohort. These demographic injections would dramatically alter the community composition. Suddenly, there's a large youth population that needs to be integrated, educated, and eventually employed. From a community planning perspective, this is chaotic and challenging. Yet towns accepted these placements, suggesting either they desperately needed the labor, which argues for economic motivations rather than charity, or they were following directives from higher authorities. Either way, it doesn't suggest organic community development so much as managed population distribution. The long-term effects are still visible in some communities. If you look at genealogical records in towns that were major orphan-trained destinations, you'll find an unusual number of family trees that suddenly start in the late 1800s with children who arrived on orphan trains. Their histories before arrival are often missing or vague. The standard explanation is that records were lost or families didn't want to discuss difficult pasts. But the pattern is consistent enough to suggest systemic obscurity rather than individual cases of missing information. It's like entire generations have origin stories that begin with "arrived on a train" and nothing before that point. Which is exactly what you'd expect if those children were part of a population that was being deliberately inserted into communities without traditional family histories. The connection between postcards and trains becomes clearer when you realize both systems were operating simultaneously and serving complementary functions. Postcards normalized the idea that children were products that could be acquired. They created market awareness, so to speak. Trains provided the physical logistics to actually move children to where they were needed. It's like any commercial operation. You need advertising to create demand, and logistics to fulfill that demand. The Victorian baby postcards were the marketing department. The orphan trains were the shipping department. Together, they formed a complete distribution system for moving human beings from production/collection points to end users. Framing it in commercial terms feels wrong because we're talking about children. But the operational structure perfectly matches commercial distribution systems, which suggests the people running this operation were thinking in exactly those terms. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, mass-produced postcards using commercial language to depict babies, systematic railway operations moving thousands of children according to predetermined schedules and quotas, government subsidies, funding the logistics, legal frameworks facilitating the process, and demographic outcomes showing population insertion into previously empty settlements. What you're looking at is infrastructure, not charity, not random social welfare efforts. Infrastructure designed to collect, process, and distribute human beings according to a plan. The fact that this infrastructure existed, operated at scale for decades, and left behind both physical evidence and demographic effects suggests it wasn't accidental or coincidental. This was planned, funded, and executed as a systematic operation. Which brings us back to the question we keep dancing around. If cities were built empty and then populated through systematic distribution of children produced or collected through institutional systems, who planned this? Why did they do it? And what happened to the original population that should have been living in those cities? But those are questions for later chapters. For now, just sit with the fact that the Victorian era had a functioning supply chain for human beings, complete with advertising, logistics, government support, and delivery infrastructure. And apparently everyone thought this was fine and normal, which tells you something about how effectively populations can be conditioned to accept things that should absolutely not be accepted. Now that we've established the infrastructure for producing and displaying babies like industrial products, we need to address a critical problem. How do you get an entire society to forget that this happened? Because if you're running a global population replacement operation, the last thing you need is everyone remembering the truth about where their children actually came from. Enter the most successful propaganda campaign in human history. a simultaneous worldwide rewrite of cultural stories about baby origins that happened so smoothly, most people still believe the fairy tales today. Let's talk about storks. You know the story. Friendly bird delivers a bundle of joy to your doorstep. Everyone's happy. No uncomfortable questions about biology or industrial incubators required. Cute story, right? Here's the weird part. This narrative became universal across completely different cultures within an absurdly short time frame. We're talking about societies that had their own distinct origin myths for children, suddenly all adopting variations of the same "babies come from somewhere else" story during the exact period when orphan trains were running and incubator exhibits. We're touring the country. The timing is about as subtle as a brick through a window, but it worked because who questions a children's story? The stork myth is particularly clever from a psychological standpoint. It trains children from an early age to accept that babies arrive from external sources rather than emerging from family lineages. You're not connected to your parents through biological processes that stretch back generations. No, you were delivered by a bird, or found in a cabbage patch, or discovered under a rock. The specific mechanism varies, but the core message is consistent. Your origin is mysterious, unknowable, and definitely not what you'd assume from looking at your family tree. It's like factory resetting society's understanding of heredity, except instead of a button you press, it's a fairy tale you tell children at bedtime, until they internalize it as normal. Now, you might argue that origin myths for children have existed throughout history in various cultures. Fair point. But here's what's suspicious. The specific formulation and global standardization of these myths during the late 1800s and early 1900s. Prior to this period, most cultures had diverse, locally specific beliefs about pregnancy and childbirth, some accurate, some wildly inaccurate, but definitely varied. Then suddenly, within a couple of decades, we get this coordinated rollout of nearly identical "babies come from mysterious external sources" narratives worldwide. European storks, American cabbage patches, various regional equivalents all saying the same basic thing. Don't ask too many questions about where babies really come from, kid. Just accept that they show up mysteriously and be happy about it. The postcards are where this gets genuinely creepy. During this same period, there's an explosion of commercial postcards. We're talking thousands of designs, showing babies in situations that seem whimsical until you think about them too hard. Babies growing in gardens like vegetables. Babies hatching from eggs. Babies being delivered by various animals or found in baskets. And here's the detail that should make your skin crawl. Many of these postcards have captions like "babies for sale" or numerical codes printed on them. Now, the official explanation is that this was just quirky Victorian humor, lighthearted jokes about the challenges of child rearing. But when you map the distribution of these postcards, they correlate suspiciously well with locations of major orphan distribution networks and incubator facilities. It's like someone was creating a visual catalog system disguised as greeting cards, which is either the strangest coincidence in postal history or evidence of something more systematic. The marketing genius of this approach is remarkable. By making the postcards cute and commercially successful, you normalize the imagery. People collect them, send them to friends, display them in their homes. The concept of babies as standardized products becomes so familiar through repetition that it stops seeming strange. It's like how advertising works today. Show people the same message enough times in friendly, non-threatening contexts, and they'll internalize it without realizing they've been conditioned. Except instead of selling you soda or cars, these postcards were selling you the idea that children don't need traditional family origins, that institutional child distribution is natural and even adorable. Unsurprisingly, this was incredibly effective. But let's get to the really systematic part of the memory erasure, the convenient disappearance of actual records. Family Bibles. You know, those massive books where previous generations meticulously recorded births, marriages, and deaths, have this strange habit of being lost or destroyed during the late 1800s. House fires, floods, simple carelessness. Always some explanation for why the family records suddenly stop right around the critical period. And it's not just one family or one town. This pattern repeats globally. Genealogists trying to trace family trees consistently hit brick walls at the same historical moment, as if someone went through with an eraser and systematically removed evidence of who people actually were and where they came from. Church records present the same problem. Churches were the primary record keepers for births, baptisms, marriages, and deaths for centuries. Their archives should be complete and reliable. Yet during this specific period, We see widespread losses of church records. Archives burn in mysterious fires. Documents are water damaged beyond recovery. Entire volumes go missing during renovations or relocations. The excuses vary, but the result is consistent. Massive gaps in the official record right when you'd most want documentation to verify what was actually happening with populations. It's like someone went through with Windex and just erased a generation from the paperwork, leaving historians and genealogists to shrug and say, well, I guess we'll never know what happened during those years. The pattern becomes even more obvious when you look at the geographical spread of these record losses. You might expect random distribution. Some areas maintain good records, others don't, depending on local circumstances. Instead, we see systematic losses across multiple countries, different regions, urban and rural areas alike. Places that had excellent record-keeping traditions for centuries suddenly experience catastrophic archive failures during the same narrow time window. The statistical probability of this being natural coincidence is basically zero. Someone was cleaning house, making sure that future generations wouldn't be able to trace their actual origins too carefully, ensuring that the official narrative would be difficult to challenge because the primary sources conveniently no longer exist. Let's talk about the institutional response to these record losses, because this is telling. When important historical documents are lost, you'd expect serious efforts to reconstruct records, investigate what happened, prevent future losses. Instead, there's this weird collective shrug. Oh, well, things were chaotic back then. Records got lost. Nothing we can do about it now. Archives that take painstaking care of documents from the 1600s and 1700s somehow can't explain what happened to records from the 1850s and 1860s. The institutional amnesia is almost aggressive in its thoroughness, not just accepting losses as inevitable, but actively discouraging investigation into why those losses happened so systematically during such a specific period. The rewriting of family histories is another fascinating aspect. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, there's this boom in people creating official family genealogies, often hiring professionals to research and document their ancestral lines. Sounds great for historical preservation, right? Except these genealogies have some interesting characteristics. They tend to go back confidently for certain periods, then become vague and uncertain around the critical reset period, then resume with confidence again afterward. It's like there's a fuzzy patch in the middle where documentation is incomplete, memories are unclear, and everyone just kind of papers over the gaps with assumptions and best guesses. These genealogies look legitimate on the surface, but when you examine them closely, they're basically bridges built over a chasm in the actual record, functional for maintaining the appearance of continuity, but not supported by solid evidence at the crucial juncture. The cultural shift in how people talked about family ancestry is notable too. Prior to this period, family connections were intensely important in most societies. People knew their relatives going back multiple generations, maintained extended family networks, and derived significant identity from ancestral lineages. After the reset period, there's this sudden cultural shift toward nuclear families and forward-looking identity. The past doesn't matter. What matters is building your future. Don't dwell on old family feuds or historical grievances. Everyone's equal in the new world. Forget about your ancestors' status. These sound like progressive modern attitudes, and maybe they were, but they also conveniently discouraged the exact kind of historical investigation that might have revealed inconsistencies in the official story about where everyone came from. The educational system played a role in this memory erasure too. As standardized schooling was implemented during this period, another suspiciously synchronized global development, the curriculum emphasized certain historical narratives while glossing over others. Children learned about grand historical events, famous leaders, technological progress, all the big, abstract stuff that doesn't require tracing individual family lines. What they didn't learn was how to research their own family histories, verify genealogical claims, or question official narratives about population origins. Education became forward-focused, preparing for the future, not questioning the past, which is great for social progress, but also super convenient if you're trying to prevent a generation from asking uncomfortable questions about where they came from. The rise of photography during this period is ironic given its role in memory. Photos should preserve history, right? Except the photo record from this era has some very convenient gaps. We have plenty of photos of buildings and infrastructure, as established earlier. We have plenty of photos from later periods showing identifiable individuals with documented histories. But photos from the transitional period tend to be weirdly anonymous. Group photos without names, individual portraits without identification, images that exist but can't be tied to specific people or families. It's like someone carefully preserved visual evidence that life existed while removing the metadata that would let you verify who those people actually were or how they connected to current populations. The photos exist, but they don't prove what you'd need them to prove to challenge the official narrative. The folklore transformation is particularly systematic. Fairy tales and folk stories get rewritten during this period to emphasize certain themes. Children found in forests, babies switched at birth, orphans discovering they're actually royalty or have special destinies. These stories normalize the idea that your apparent family might not be your real family, that origins can be mysterious or even false, that discovering your true identity might involve learning you came from somewhere completely different than you. Thought. Reading these stories as entertainment is one thing, but when you realize they were being mass-produced and distributed during a period when actual children were being systematically moved through orphan distribution networks, the stories take on a different character. They're not just entertainment. They're psychological preparation, teaching children that disrupted or mysterious family connections are normal, romantic even, rather than traumatic or suspicious. The speed of cultural change during this period is itself a red flag. Cultural shifts normally take generations. Deeply embedded beliefs about family, identity, and social structure don't transform overnight. Yet within a couple of decades, spanning the late 1800s and early 1900s, we see fundamental changes in how people think about ancestry, family connections, and child origins. Traditional extended family structures give way to nuclear families. Rigid social hierarchies, supposedly based on bloodlines, soften into more merit-based systems. Cultural attitudes toward orphans shift from stigma to sympathy and civic duty. These are all positive developments in many ways, but the pace of change is historically unusual. It's like someone hit fast forward on social evolution, accelerating transformations that would normally take a century into just a few decades, which is possible through organic social forces. But it's also what you'd expect if there were coordinated efforts to reshape how society thought about these issues. The timing coordination is too precise to ignore. Around the world, different societies with different languages, cultures, and traditions all simultaneously develop similar approaches to explaining baby origins, similar patterns of record loss, similar educational reforms, similar cultural shifts. Regarding family identity, this happens within roughly the same 30 to 50-year window globally. Now, there was increasing global communication during this period: telegraph, steamships, early international organizations. But was communication really good enough to coordinate such subtle, pervasive cultural changes across continents? The logistics seem challenging unless there was some centralized planning happening through channels that aren't well documented in the historical record, which is convenient for those who might prefer that such planning not be too obvious to future researchers. The linguistic evidence is interesting too. Words and phrases related to adoption, orphans, and found children undergo shifts in meaning and connotation during this period. Terms that were previously neutral or even negative become more positive and normalized. New vocabulary emerges for describing institutional child-rearing and placement systems. The language evolves in ways that make it easier to talk about children being moved through systematic distribution networks without it sounding dystopian or disturbing. It's like how corporate euphemisms work. Instead of firing people, you're right-sizing the organization. Instead of taking children from their families and distributing them to strangers, you're finding forever homes for orphans in need. Framing makes all the difference in how people emotionally respond to what's happening. The generational cutoff is particularly revealing. When people today trace their family trees, there's this remarkably consistent point where documentation becomes sparse or unreliable, and it's usually right around the mid to late 1800s. Earlier than that, records often don't exist or are too degraded to be useful, which is understandable given the age. Later than that, records are generally good because you're getting into the modern era of systematic documentation. But there's this specific window where you'd expect records to exist and be accessible, yet they're mysteriously problematic. Genealogists joke about brick walls in their research, and for a huge percentage of families, those brick walls sit right in the period we're discussing. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe that's exactly where the historical record was deliberately disrupted to prevent easy verification of family continuities. The psychological mechanism of cultural amnesia is fascinating. It doesn't require conspiracy or active cover-up. if you can simply make people not want to remember. Create new, forward-looking identities focused on individual achievement rather than family lineage. Emphasize that the past is less important than the future. Make investigating ancestry seem like an eccentric hobby rather than a basic element of personal identity. Normalize discontinuity in family knowledge. Oh, nobody knows much about great-great-grandpa, those records were lost. Until it's unremarkable that people don't actually know where their families came from more than a few generations back. Once you establish this cultural norm, the amnesia becomes self-perpetuating. People don't investigate because it seems normal not to know, and the less they investigate, the more normal it seems not to know. It's a perfect feedback loop for obscuring historical truth. So what are we looking at? A coordinated global effort to rewrite cultural narratives about child origins, coinciding with systematic destruction of documentary evidence, supported by educational reforms that discouraged historical investigation, reinforced through commercial products that normalized institutional child distribution, and maintained through cultural shifts that made ancestry seem less important than individual futures. All happening during the exact same period when cities were sitting empty, incubator technology was scaling up industrially, and orphan trains were moving tens of thousands of children across continents. The pieces fit together into a picture of deliberate cultural engineering, a project to ensure that the generation being installed into those empty cities wouldn't remember and couldn't verify where they actually came from. Memory wasn't just lost through the accidents of history. It was systematically erased through multiple coordinated mechanisms designed to prevent future generations from reconstructing what really happened. And based on how little most people today know about their family histories beyond a few generations, the erasure was remarkably successful. The question is, what exactly was being hidden, and who benefits from keeping it hidden? So we've got empty cities, industrial baby production, carnival displays conditioning society, and systematic memory erasure. But here's what's missing from this picture: the why. What's the ideological framework that would make people think any of this was a good idea? Enter eugenics, the pseudoscientific movement that convinced educated people across the globe that humanity could be improved through selective breeding and population control. And wouldn't you know it, the eugenics movement reaches its absolute peak right during our supposed reset period, offering a convenient philosophical justification for everything we've been discussing. Now, when most people hear eugenics today, they think of the horrific stuff from World War II, which was indeed terrible. But the eugenics movement started way earlier and was way more mainstream than most folks realize. We're talking respectable scientists, university professors, government officials, and social reformers, all enthusiastically promoting the idea that humanity could be scientifically managed like a farm breeding program. The movement had serious institutional backing: eugenics societies, academic journals, international conferences, government funding. This wasn't fringe conspiracy theory stuff. This was the establishment consensus among educated elites during the late 1800s and early 1900s, which makes it even more disturbing when you consider what they were actually proposing. The core concept of eugenics is deceptively simple. Some people have better genetic traits than others, and society should encourage good people to have more children, while discouraging or preventing bad people from reproducing. Sounds scientific, right? Except the definitions of good and bad were conveniently determined by people who already had power, and unsurprisingly, they tended to classify themselves and people like them as the superior specimens worthy of reproduction. Poor people? Inferior genetics. Immigrants? Probably defective. Anyone who didn't fit the ideal of white, middle-class respectability? Better not let them breed too much. It was scientific racism and classism, dressed up in academic language, which is unfortunately a time-honored tradition that continues in various forms today. But here's where it connects to our reset theory. Eugenic leaders weren't just talking about encouraging some births and discouraging others through social policy. They were openly discussing the idea of creating entirely new populations from scratch. We're talking about statements like designing the humans of tomorrow and scientific management of reproduction on a mass scale. In the context of what we know about incubator technology and orphan distribution systems, these statements take on much more literal interpretation than just metaphorical aspirations. They weren't just philosophizing about some distant future. They were describing practical programs that could be implemented with existing technology, which they conveniently had access to through their institutional connections. The organizational networks are revealing. When you map out the leadership of eugenics societies, you find significant overlap with people involved in other relevant institutions. Board members of eugenic organizations also serve on boards of orphanages. Funders of eugenic research also invest in incubator technology companies. Academic researchers studying heredity also consult for child placement agencies. It's like a Venn diagram, where all the circles overlap in the middle, creating a unified network of people and institutions, all working toward compatible goals. Either this is an extraordinary coincidence, or these movements were deliberately coordinated by people who understood they were pieces of a larger project. The timeline is suspicious as always. The eugenics movement explodes onto the scene right around the 1880s and 1890s, exactly when we're seeing empty cities, industrial incubators, and orphan distribution networks operating at scale. The movement's popularity peaks during the period when the supposed reset would have been in full swing, then gradually declines after the early 1900s, once the new population would have been successfully integrated into society. It's like eugenics provided the ideological cover during the critical years when the system needed philosophical justification, then became less necessary once the project was complete and the new social order was established. Convenient timing for a supposedly independent intellectual movement. Let's talk about what eugenic ideology actually enabled in practical terms. By establishing that population control was scientifically legitimate and socially beneficial, eugenics gave authorities permission to intervene in reproductive matters on a massive scale. Forced sterilizations, which happened in the thousands in the United States and many other countries, became legally acceptable because eugenics said they were for the good of society. Removing children from unfit parents and placing them in institutions or with better families became standard practice, justified by eugenic theories about heredity and environment. The ideology created a framework where taking children from their biological families and redistributing them according to scientific principles seemed not just acceptable, but morally mandatory. Sound familiar? The international coordination of the eugenics movement is particularly noteworthy. This wasn't just an American phenomenon or a European thing. It was global. International eugenics congresses brought together researchers, policymakers, and activists from multiple continents to share ideas and coordinate strategies. National eugenics societies maintained regular communication and collaboration. Research findings were quickly disseminated across borders. The movement had a level of international organization that seems unusual for a supposedly grassroots intellectual development, especially given the communication limitations of the era. It's almost like someone was coordinating a worldwide effort to ensure eugenic ideology was simultaneously promoted across multiple countries, creating consistent philosophical justification for population management programs that were happening globally. Now let's connect this to another suspicious pattern: the remarkable synchronization of administrative systems during this exact same period. Between roughly 1850 and 1900, societies around the world independently decide to implement nearly identical bureaucratic reforms. National birth registration systems appear almost simultaneously across multiple countries. Mandatory schooling laws get passed within years of each other in nations that have limited direct communication. Time zones get standardized globally, literally everyone agreeing to slice up the day the same way at roughly the same moment in history. Centralized archives and record-keeping systems emerge everywhere at once. Either humanity experienced a collective epiphany about administrative efficiency, or someone was rolling out a coordinated plan. The birth registration systems deserve special attention because they're absolutely critical for population control. Before these systems, births were recorded locally, inconsistently, and often not at all. Tracking individuals across regions was difficult, verifying identities was challenging, and maintaining population statistics was basically guesswork. Then, suddenly, within a few decades, most developed nations implement comprehensive birth registration systems with standardized forms, centralized databases, and legal requirements for documentation. This happens too quickly and too uniformly to be natural evolution. Someone wanted the ability to track and identify every individual from birth forward, and they wanted this capability implemented globally within a relatively short time frame. Which is exactly what you'd need if you were installing a new population and wanted to maintain control over their identities and movements. Mandatory schooling is another piece of this puzzle. Compulsory education laws sweep across the world during this period, requiring all children to attend state-controlled institutions for a significant portion of their developmental years. The official justification is literacy, social progress, preparing citizens for modern society, all reasonable goals. But mandatory schooling also serves other functions. It separates children from families for most of the day, allowing state institutions to shape their education and ideology. It standardizes knowledge and beliefs across entire populations, ensuring everyone learns the same historical narratives and cultural values. It creates opportunities for systematic observation and assessment of children, identifying any who might not fit expected patterns. For a system trying to integrate a newly installed population, mandatory schooling is incredibly useful infrastructure. The speed of educational reform implementation is what makes it suspicious. Educational systems normally evolve gradually over generations. You don't just wake up one day and decide every child in the country needs to attend school for 8 years. Yet that's essentially what happens globally during this period. Within a few decades, most developed nations go from having educational systems serving small percentages of children to having comprehensive, compulsory education for everyone. The logistics alone are staggering. Building schools, training teachers, developing curriculum, funding operations. Yet somehow this happens nearly simultaneously in countries with vastly different economic situations, political systems, and cultural traditions. Either education reform was the most successful international trend in history, or there was coordination happening behind the scenes to ensure these systems were implemented everywhere at once. Time zone standardization is genuinely weird when you think about it. For all of human history, each locality kept its own time based on the sun. Noon was when the sun was highest in your specific location. This created some coordination challenges. As travel and communication improved, sure, but societies had managed for millennia without global time coordination. Then in the span of about 2 decades, starting in the 1880s, the entire world agrees to divide itself into standardized time zones with synchronized clocks. The International Meridian Conference of 1884 establishes the Greenwich Meridian as the prime meridian and creates the global time zone system we still use today. Countries across continents all adopt this system within years of each other. That level of international cooperation and rapid implementation for what's essentially an arbitrary convention is remarkable, especially in an era when international coordination was supposedly difficult. Why does time zone standardization matter for a reset theory? Because controlling time measurement is fundamental to controlling history. If everyone's using the same time system with synchronized records, it becomes much easier to create consistent historical narratives and maintain official chronologies. Dating events precisely across different regions becomes possible, which means verifying or fabricating timelines becomes more manageable. You can synchronize the when of events globally, ensuring that official histories from different countries align properly. It's much harder to maintain a fabricated historical narrative when different regions are all using different timekeeping methods. The inconsistencies would become obvious. But with global time standardization, you can ensure that everyone's timeline matches the official story. Census systems also undergo remarkable coordination during this period. Population censuses have existed in various forms for centuries, but systematic, regular, comprehensive national censuses with standardized methodologies become nearly universal during the late 1800s. And here's the interesting part. Many countries conduct major censuses right around the critical reset period, often showing unexplained demographic changes or population increases that don't match natural growth rates. The censuses themselves become tools for establishing the official population numbers that future records will reference, essentially cementing whatever demographic situation existed at that moment as the baseline reality. Convenient if you've just installed a new population and need to create documentation that makes it seem like those people were always there. Measurement standardization is another coordinated development. The metric system spreads globally during this period, with many countries adopting standardized units of measurement within the same few decades. Weights, distances, volumes, all getting unified under international standards. This is presented as rational modernization, making trade and science easier across borders. Fair enough. But standardized measurement systems also make it easier to implement coordinated projects across multiple regions. If you're building cities according to a master plan in different countries, having everyone use the same measurements helps ensure consistency. If you're producing goods or equipment that needs to work across multiple locations, standardization is essential. The practical benefits are real, but the timing and coordination suggest these reforms were part of a larger program of global systematization. Archival systems centralization is particularly relevant to our memory erasure discussion. During this period, countries establish national archives, create professional archival standards, and consolidate historical records into centralized repositories. This is framed as preservation and organization. protecting important documents for future generations. But centralization also means control. When records are scattered across thousands of local churches, town halls, and private collections, it's hard for any authority to control what's preserved and what's accessible. When everything's consolidated into centralized archives managed by state-appointed professionals, control becomes much easier. Records that don't fit the official narrative can be quietly excluded. Documents that might raise inconvenient questions can be restricted or lost. The historical record can be curated to support whatever story the authorities want to tell. The professionalization of history as an academic discipline happens during this same period. Before the late 1800s, history was often written by amateurs, antiquarians, and enthusiasts working independently. Then suddenly, history becomes a formal academic field with professional standards, peer review, and gatekeeping institutions. Historians are trained in universities, follow established methodologies, and build their careers within institutional structures. This professionalizes historical knowledge, which has benefits: more rigorous research, better source criticism, higher standards of evidence. But it also creates an orthodoxy. The approved methods, accepted interpretations, and mainstream narratives become difficult to challenge, because challenging them means going against professional consensus. Alternative theories get marginalized as unprofessional or unscholarly. The range of acceptable historical inquiry gets bounded by institutional norms, which is very convenient if you want to ensure that certain questions don't get asked too persistently. Let's connect all this back to eugenics and the reset theory. Eugenic ideology provided the philosophical justification for population control and replacement. It made the idea of scientifically managing human reproduction seem not just acceptable, but morally imperative. Meanwhile, coordinated administrative reforms created the infrastructure necessary to implement such a program: birth registration to track individuals, mandatory schooling to shape their development, time standardization to control historical narratives, census systems to establish official demographics, archival centralization to manage historical records, and professional historical gatekeeping to ensure alternative narratives didn't gain traction. These pieces fit together into a system capable of installing a new population and maintaining control over how that population understood its origins in history. The decline of eugenics after the early 1900s is telling. Once the movement achieved its peak influence during the critical reset period, it gradually loses mainstream support. By the 1930s and 1940s, especially after World War II's atrocities, eugenics becomes increasingly discredited and eventually taboo. It's like the ideology served its purpose during the critical years when justification was needed, then became expendable once the project was complete, and potentially embarrassing as evidence of what was done. The movement's rise, peak, and fall perfectly bracket the period when a population reset would have been implemented. That's either remarkable coincidence or suggestive timing. The institutional connections persisted even as the eugenics label became toxic. The organizations, funding streams, and personnel networks that supported eugenics didn't disappear. They just rebranded. Population control initiatives, genetic research programs, social engineering projects continued under new names with cleaner reputations. The fundamental belief that human populations could and should be scientifically managed didn't go away. It just learned to use less offensive language, which suggests that whatever project eugenics was part of, it didn't end when the movement lost its public face. The work continued under different branding, serving the same ultimate goals of population management and social control. So where does this leave us? We have an ideological movement promoting population replacement as scientific progress, coinciding with industrial technologies capable of implementing such replacement, supported by coordinated administrative systems that create the infrastructure for population control and historical narrative management. The timing is too precise, the coordination too systematic, and the functional integration too complete to be coincidental. Either humanity experienced the most remarkable period of spontaneous global cooperation in history, with multiple independent movements all happening to peak simultaneously during the same few decades, and all happening to support complementary goals, or there was a coordinated project involving eugenic ideology as justification, incubator technology as implementation, administrative reform as infrastructure, and cultural conditioning as maintenance. The evidence doesn't prove the reset theory definitively, but it makes the conventional explanation, that all this just happened naturally and coincidentally, seem increasingly implausible. When you see this many pieces fitting together this perfectly, At some point, you have to consider that maybe they were designed to fit together. That maybe someone was working from a blueprint, rather than society just randomly stumbling into this particular configuration of systems and beliefs. So we've laid out this massive theory involving empty cities, industrial baby production, memory erasure, and coordinated global systems. Pretty wild stuff. But here's the thing about cover-ups. They're never perfect. No matter how thorough the cleanup operation, evidence always slips through the cracks. Documents get misfiled instead of destroyed. Photos end up in the wrong attic. Personal diaries survive in basements that nobody bothers to check. And occasionally, somebody actually reads this stuff and realizes it doesn't quite match the official story. This chapter is about those accidents, the evidence that survived despite someone's best efforts to make it disappear. Let's start with personal diaries and letters, because people in the 1800s were surprisingly prolific writers. They kept journals, wrote letters to relatives, documented their daily lives in ways that social media users today would recognize as ancestral blogging. Most of these writings are mundane: weather observations, grocery lists, complaints about neighbors. But occasionally you find entries that are genuinely strange. References to children appearing in communities without any clear origin story. Mentions of government children, or institution babies, being distributed to families. Observations about entire groups of young people who have no family connections or personal histories beyond a certain point. These aren't the kind of details you'd expect to find if everything was happening naturally. But they're exactly what you'd expect if a population replacement program was running and some observers were confused or suspicious about what they were seeing. The medical records are particularly interesting because they reveal inconsistencies that are hard to explain away. Hospital archives occasionally contain patient files with impossible gaps in personal history. Adult patients with no documented childhood illnesses, no vaccination records, no family medical background. It's like their medical existence begins at age 10 or 12, as if they materialized fully formed into the healthcare system. Now, you could argue that record-keeping was just poor in this era, and sometimes that's true. But when you see this pattern repeatedly in records from the same time period across different hospitals and different regions, it starts looking less like poor record-keeping and more like systemic gaps corresponding to people whose early lives weren't documented because they didn't have conventional early lives. Then there are the photographs with problematic dates. Photography enthusiasts and collectors sometimes find images with inscriptions or documentation that don't match what the photo actually shows. Like a building supposedly constructed in 1885, appearing in a photograph dated 1870, looking already complete and weathered. Or group photos of children at institutions dated years before those institutions officially opened. The discrepancies are usually small enough that people assume someone made an error in dating or labeling, which is a reasonable assumption. But when you compile these anomalies, they tend to cluster around the same critical period we've been discussing, and they consistently show infrastructure existing earlier than official records claim. It's like someone was careless with the cover story, creating documentation that doesn't quite align with the physical evidence preserved in the photographs. Equipment discoveries are fascinating because physical objects are harder to explain away than documentary inconsistencies. Occasionally, when old hospitals get renovated or demolished, workers find medical equipment in storage rooms or sealed basements that doesn't match what's described in medical textbooks from that era. Incubator designs that are supposedly from the early 1900s showing up in hospital wings built in the 1870s. Life support systems that seem too advanced for their supposed manufacturing date. Instruments designed for purposes that don't make sense given the official medical knowledge of the time. These discoveries get written up in local newspapers as curiosities. Mysterious antique medical equipment found in hospital basement, but rarely investigated deeply enough to explain why equipment inconsistent with the historical timeline was there in the first place. The declassified documents are probably the most directly revealing, though also the most frustrating because they're rare and often heavily redacted. Government archives occasionally release documents that were classified for national security reasons, usually because enough time has passed that whatever information they contain is considered no longer sensitive. Some of these documents relate to population management programs, child distribution initiatives, or institutional care systems during the late 1800s and early 1900s. The documents that do get released often have sections blacked out, making it difficult to understand the full context. But even the portions that are visible sometimes contain references to programs, facilities, or operations that aren't part of the standard historical narrative. References to population placement operations, or systematic child distribution networks, or coordinated demographic management, that sound much more organized and deliberate than the supposedly ad hoc orphan train system described in mainstream history books. Church records that survived the mysterious fires and losses sometimes contain interesting anomalies too. Baptismal records showing batches of children all baptized on the same day, with similar age ranges but no parental information listed. Marriage records where both parties have documented histories that only go back a certain number of years, as if they appeared in the community simultaneously as teenagers or young adults. Death records noting unusual patterns, like entire age cohorts being mysteriously absent from a community during certain periods, or demographic distributions that don't match natural population pyramids. Parish priests apparently noticed these patterns too, because some surviving correspondence includes questions or concerns about the unusual demographic situations in their communities, though these letters rarely receive documented responses from church authorities. Cemetery records and headstone surveys reveal some interesting patterns as well. When researchers do systematic surveys of old cemeteries, they sometimes notice gaps in burial dates corresponding to the critical reset period. It's not that nobody died during these years. There are burials, but the age distributions of the deceased don't match what you'd expect from natural mortality patterns. Too few elderly people, suggesting missing generations. Too many children and young adults, suggesting populations that didn't live long after being installed. Headstones with dates that don't quite add up. Birth years that would make the deceased's life story inconsistent with other documented facts. Graves marked only with numbers instead of names, suggesting institutional burials of people whose identities weren't considered important enough to memorialize properly. Not exactly the family cemetery aesthetic you'd expect in an era supposedly obsessed with heritage and lineage. Immigration records present another source of inconsistent information. When researchers examine immigration data from this period, the numbers sometimes don't add up. Census populations increase faster than can be explained by documented immigration and natural birth rates. Regions show population surges that aren't matched by corresponding records of immigrant arrivals. The demographic math just doesn't work unless you assume significant undocumented population influx, which raises obvious questions about where these people came from, if they weren't going through normal immigration channels. The standard explanation is that record-keeping was incomplete, which is certainly true to some extent. But the specific patterns of incompleteness, always in ways that obscure population origins during the critical period, seem suspiciously convenient. School records from this era occasionally contain notes that seem innocuous until you think about them carefully. Comments about students having no family information on file, or placed by state authorities, or arrived from institution. References to entire classes of children all entering the school system at the same time with similar age ranges and backgrounds. Observations about students who seem unusually unfamiliar with local customs or regional history, despite supposedly being from the area. These are scattered notes in otherwise routine administrative records, but they paint a picture of educational institutions processing waves of children with mysterious or institutional origins, rather than children emerging naturally from local families. The architectural discoveries keep turning up too. When old buildings get renovated, construction crews sometimes find design features that don't match the building's supposed age or purpose. Hospital wings with infrastructure for much larger patient loads than the official records indicate were ever treated there. School buildings with classroom layouts suggesting much larger student populations than the community supposedly had. Residential structures with institutional features, numbered rooms, standardized layouts, shared facilities, that seem odd for what are supposedly private family homes. These physical traces suggest the buildings were designed and used differently than official histories claim, supporting the theory that infrastructure was built to process and house populations on a larger scale than conventional narratives. Acknowledge. Personal testimony occasionally surfaces too, though it's usually dismissed as unreliable memory or misunderstanding. Elderly people in the early 1900s sometimes told stories to their grandchildren about when all the children came, or the year the trains brought the new people, or before everyone arrived. These stories get passed down as family oddities, confused memories from old people who mixed up their timeline or didn't understand what was happening. But when you collect these scattered accounts, they show remarkable consistency in describing a period when populations arrived suddenly rather than growing gradually, when children appeared in communities without clear family connections, when the Demographic composition of regions changed rapidly in ways that seemed unusual even to contemporary observers. The statistical anomalies are hard to dismiss, even if the qualitative evidence can be argued away. When researchers do detailed demographic analysis of census data from this period, they find patterns that are difficult to explain through natural population processes. Age pyramid distortions that don't match typical demographic transitions. Sex ratios that deviate from biological norms. Migration patterns that seem inconsistent with economic or environmental factors. Geographic distributions of population characteristics that suggest planned placement rather than organic settlement. These are the kinds of statistical signatures you'd expect from a managed population installation rather than natural demographic evolution. And they're right there in the official data for anyone willing to look at the numbers with sufficient skepticism about the conventional narrative. The technological inconsistencies are another category of evidence. Sometimes, researchers examining patents, industrial records, or technical specifications from this era find that certain technologies existed earlier than they supposedly should have based on the standard history of innovation. Incubator designs that are too sophisticated for their patent date. Childcare equipment showing features that wouldn't become standard until decades later. Medical instruments with capabilities that seem to require knowledge not yet developed according to official histories of medical science. These anomalies suggest that some technological developments happened differently than the public narrative claims, possibly because they were developed for specific purposes that official histories don't acknowledge. So what do we do with all this scattered evidence? Individually, each piece can be explained away. Misfiled documents, confused memories, record-keeping errors, dating mistakes. Any single anomaly is dismissible, but collectively, they create a pattern that's harder to ignore. Too many coincidences all pointing in the same direction. Too many gaps and inconsistencies all clustering around the same historical period. Too many suggestions of systematic population management all emerging from independent sources. At some point, the accumulation of evidence starts suggesting that the conventional narrative is incomplete at best, and possibly deliberately misleading. The thing about evidence that survives despite cleanup efforts is that it's usually the stuff that seemed unimportant at the time. Nobody bothers to destroy a random family diary because it doesn't seem significant. A misfiled hospital record isn't worth tracking down if you're trying to suppress major documentation. Photographs in private collections escape notice because the censorship operation can't check everywhere. The evidence that survives tends to be scattered, fragmentary, and individually unconvincing, which is exactly why it survived. If it had been obviously important, it would have been suppressed. But precisely because it seems like random historical debris, it accumulates over time into a body of evidence that collectively tells a very different story than the official histories present. So here we are at the end of our investigation, and it's time to ask the uncomfortable question. If any of this is true, what does it mean for us? Because if the reset theory holds water, if there really was a massive population replacement operation in the late 1800s involving empty cities prepared in advance, industrial baby production, systematic child distribution, cultural memory erasure, eugenic ideology, coordinated global administrative systems, and cleanup operations that mostly but not completely succeeded, then we're not who we've been told we are. Our connection to the past isn't what we thought. Our family histories might be fabrications, or at least highly incomplete. Our collective identity as a civilization might be built on a foundation of carefully constructed mythology rather than actual continuity stretching back through the centuries. Let's be clear about what this theory actually claims. It's not saying our grandparents were grown in test tubes or that we're clones or anything science fiction like that. It's saying that somewhere around 150 to 200 years ago, there was a systematic effort to install a new population, whether through mass production of orphans via industrial incubator systems, through distribution of existing children from unknown sources, or through some combination of methods we can only partially reconstruct from fragmentary evidence. These children were placed into prepared cities, given institutional upbringings, or assigned to families, educated in standardized schools, documented in newly created bureaucratic systems, and surrounded by cultural narratives designed to prevent them from questioning their origins too deeply. That generation became our great-great-grandparents, the ancestors we trace our lineages back to, the foundation of our family trees. And if they were installed rather than naturally descended from earlier populations, then our genealogies are much shorter than we think, and our connection to deeper history is through institutional narrative rather than biological continuity. The identity implications are genuinely profound. We construct our sense of self partly through understanding where we come from, our family heritage, ancestral backgrounds, ethnic identities, cultural traditions supposedly passed down through generations. What happens to all that if it turns out the transmission chain is broken somewhere in the late 1800s? If your great-great-grandparents were children distributed through an orphan train system rather than growing up in established families, then claims about ancestral homeland, inherited cultural knowledge, or family traditions stretching back centuries become questionable. This doesn't make you less of a person, obviously, but it does change what you are. You're not the heir to a long family lineage. You're the descendant of a demographic installation event, your heritage more institutional than ancestral. The psychological resistance to this theory is understandable. We want to believe we're connected to the past through unbroken chains of ancestry stretching back through the generations. We want our family stories to be real, our genealogical research to uncover genuine heritage, our sense of identity to be grounded in authentic historical continuity. Considering that all of this might be partially or largely fabricated is disturbing. It's like being adopted but not knowing it. The family relationships are real and meaningful, but the assumed biological connections aren't what you thought. Nobody likes discovering that their understanding of their own origins is incomplete or inaccurate. The emotional investment in conventional family history is strong enough that people will dismiss mountains of contrary evidence to preserve their comfortable narratives about where they came from. But here's the thing. Whether the reset theory is completely true, partially true, or wildly inaccurate, engaging with it seriously forces us to ask important questions about how we know what we know about the past. How much of our historical knowledge is based on solid documentary evidence versus assumptions and conventional narratives we've never questioned? When we trace our family trees, how carefully do we verify each connection? And how often do we paper over gaps with assumptions that seem reasonable but aren't actually proven? When genealogical records mysteriously end at a certain period, do we investigate why? Or do we just shrug and assume record-keeping was poor back then? The reset theory, even if wrong, serves a valuable function by pushing us to examine our certainty about historical narratives that maybe aren't as solidly established as we like to think. The evidence we've reviewed across these chapters doesn't definitively prove the reset theory. There are alternative explanations for everything we've discussed. Explanations that don't require assuming a massive coordinated population replacement operation. Empty city photographs could be explained by photography techniques and timing. Industrial incubators could have been genuinely medical rather than population production facilities. Orphan trains could have been humanitarian responses to real social problems, rather than distribution mechanisms for artificially produced populations. Record losses could be natural rather than systematic destruction. The coordination of administrative systems could reflect genuine progressive reform rather than reset infrastructure. The eugenic movement could have been purely ideological without practical implementation. Each piece of evidence can be argued away if you're committed to defending the conventional narrative. But the accumulation of coincidences is what makes the conventional explanation start to feel strained. Too many suspicious patterns all emerging during the same narrow time window. Too much coordination across supposedly independent developments. Too many gaps in records at exactly the points where you'd need documentation to verify the official story. Too much infrastructure built in advance of the populations that supposedly justified it. At some point, the simpler explanation might be that all these pieces are connected, that there was a coordinated program, that the patterns we see are traces of systematic planning, that the gaps in evidence exist because someone wanted to obscure what actually happened. The conventional narrative requires us to believe in a whole lot of remarkable coincidences, all happening simultaneously for independent reasons. The reset theory requires us to believe in a coordinated project that we weren't told about. Both require some level of faith in the absence of complete evidence. The question is, which explanation better fits the available data? What would it mean practically if the reset theory turned out to be verifiable? Not much would change in daily life, honestly. Your relationships with your family don't depend on whether you're connected to them through 6 generations or 3. Your cultural identity can be real and meaningful, even if it's based on institutional transmission rather than biological descent. The person you are today isn't altered by discovering that your ancestry is different than you thought. But intellectually and psychologically, the implications are significant. Our understanding of civilization, progress, social development, all of that gets reframed if we're actually descendants of a demographic engineering project rather than the end product of organic human population evolution. History becomes something done to us rather than something we emerged from, which changes how we think about agency, continuity, and our relationship to the past. The question of who orchestrated this potential reset, if it happened, remains largely unanswered by the evidence we can access. The coordination required suggests institutional power at a very high level, probably governmental, possibly international, definitely involving significant resources and authority. But the specifics of who knew what, who gave orders, who implemented the program, and what their ultimate goals were remain obscure. Maybe that information was never documented in accessible form. Maybe it was documented but successfully destroyed. Maybe it's sitting in classified archives that won't be opened for another century. Or maybe the whole operation was sufficiently compartmentalized that most participants didn't understand the full scope of what they were part of, leaving no comprehensive record because no single person or organization had the complete picture. The purpose question is equally mysterious. Why would anyone do this? What problem were they trying to solve by replacing populations? Was it a response to genuine demographic catastrophe that official histories don't acknowledge? Was it about consolidating control by installing populations with no independent traditions or power structures? Was it eugenic ideology taken to its logical conclusion, creating new populations according to scientific specifications? Was it about erasing some inconvenient historical truth by literally replacing the people who might remember it? Without access to the planning documents, assuming they existed and survived, we're left speculating about motives based on outcomes. And the outcomes are ambiguous enough that you could construct multiple motive theories that all seem plausible. What we can say is that if something like this happened, it was remarkably effective. The vast majority of people today have no idea there's even a question about 19th century population origins. The conventional narrative is accepted without serious interrogation. Genealogical research dead ends are treated as unfortunate rather than suspicious. The evidence pointing towards something unusual is scattered, fragmentary, and easily dismissed. If this was a cover-up, it was extremely successful. Not because all evidence was destroyed, but because enough was destroyed and enough cultural conditioning was implemented that the surviving evidence doesn't get taken seriously. People have been trained to accept conventional explanations reflexively and to treat alternative theories as conspiracy nonsense rather than legitimate historical questions worth investigating. That's some impressive social engineering, if it was deliberate. So where does that leave us as individuals trying to understand who we are and where we came from? In uncertainty, mostly. We can't prove definitively that the reset happened, but we also can't prove it didn't. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. The anomalies are real, but interpretable in multiple ways. We're left in the uncomfortable position of having to make choices about what to believe based on incomplete information, which is actually the human condition generally. But it feels particularly acute when it comes to fundamental questions about our origins and identity. Do we accept the conventional narrative on faith because it's comfortable and socially supported? Do we embrace alternative theories because the evidence seems compelling despite institutional rejection? Do we just admit we don't know and can't know for certain, and learn to live with that uncertainty? Maybe the most important takeaway isn't whether the reset theory is true, but rather that we should maintain healthy skepticism about all historical narratives, including official ones. Question the stories you've been told. Look for evidence rather than accepting claims on authority. Notice gaps and inconsistencies rather than papering over them with convenient assumptions. Be willing to consider that major aspects of accepted history might be incomplete or inaccurate. This doesn't mean becoming a paranoid conspiracy theorist who believes nothing and suspects everything. It means applying consistent standards of evidence to all claims about the past, including, maybe especially, the ones that seem most obviously true because everyone agrees with them. The reset theory, true or false, serves as a case study in how difficult it is to really know historical truth. We think we understand the past because we have books and documents and institutions dedicated to preserving history. But what if those sources are biased, incomplete, or deliberately misleading? What if significant events were never documented, or were documented and then destroyed? What if cultural transmission contains systematic errors that compound over generations? The confidence with which we assert historical facts starts to seem less justified when you realize how much of it rests on assumptions that could be wrong. Maybe we know less about where we came from than we think we do. Maybe that's okay. Maybe learning to live with uncertainty about our origins is part of growing up as a civilization. In the end, whether your great-great-grandparents were born into established families or distributed through an orphan train system, you're still here dealing with the present and facing the future. Your value as a person doesn't depend on having a genealogy stretching back to nobility or famous ancestors. Your cultural identity doesn't require unbroken biological transmission through centuries. You are who you are based on your choices, your relationships, your actions, not based on whose DNA you inherited or which population group your ancestors belonged to. The past is interesting and important for understanding how we got here, but it doesn't determine who we can become. So investigate the anomalies if you're curious. Question the official narratives if they seem suspicious. But don't let uncertainty about the past prevent you from confidently building your future. We're all heirs to whatever history we actually had, whether that's the comfortable conventional narrative or the disturbing alternative possibilities. What matters is what we do with that inheritance, however we obtained it.